the bed turning was basically a way that ladies in the past could introduce to their neighbors and friends in the area their best handiwork. And so what they would usually do in the olden days is when she wanted to show off her quilts that she'd make through the years, she would invite all the ladies in town or from her church over, and they would have refreshments and a day of bed turning. And before the guests would arrive, she would spread her quilts out on the bed like this. They'd have a whole bunch of the quilts on the bed. And they'd all be stacked up, and when they arrived, they'd gather around the bed to see her beautiful quilts. And she would describe each one of her quilts and her workmanship as they would come off the bed. And so this way they could really be up close and personal and see what a great seamstress she was. Back in those days, that was a big part of a woman's acknowledgement in her family and in her community, was how good of a handy stitcher she was. So that was an important thing for her. So we're going to start our bed turning today with our first quilt here. It looks like it has some Civil War fabrics in it, and it appears to be late 1800s to early 1900s. These all came from shirts and dresses and skirts, children's clothing, men's shirts and women's dresses, and then they were put into these quilts. And Judy then just recently quilted this and made it into a quilt finally. It had gone all that time stored somewhere and had never been put together, and she just finally finished this. So it was a nice addition to put that number one in our presentation today.
Is this the one she washed and stuff?
Yes, and she washed this quilt just as a note that this quilt had been stored in somebody's home that had been a smoker, and so it was heavily permeated with that cigarette smoke, and she washed it, like 2 or 3 times and soaked it to try to get that odor out of there. So it's very difficult once that nicotine gets permeated into fabrics like that. So that was number one. The second one is a beautiful quilt called the Drunkard's Path. This is a variation of a Drunkard's Path. It was likely made in the 1930s by a Melissa Harshbarger of Benton, Montana. She stitched it on a white treadle sewing machine, which she also used to do the quilting. Now, that's kind of interesting because we're talking 1930s, and a lot of people kind of get the idea that, oh my goodness, you never would quilt a quilt on a sewing machine back then. And if you look closely on this, maybe you can see the stitching up here, but you can see that the stitching line is just big enough. That's maybe, 7 inches or so. And that would be just big enough for her to slide that under her treadle sewing machine throat and stitch that quilt. Treadle sewing machines came out in 1864, and it didn't take women very long to figure out, hey, I can quilt these quilts a whole lot faster if I can put that on some kind of frame that they connive their husband into making for them, and push that sucker through my treadle sewing machine. And look at that smile on that lady's face. How happy she is, even though her arm is breaking from having to push that thing through there. She's really happy that she can be quilting that thing on her treadle sewing machine. So that's pretty incredible, I think. And so they were quilting these quilts on those machines quite early on. And that was way before 1930, because you can tell by her dress. That was probably before the turn of the century that she was quilting that quilt. So other names for this pattern, however, are Drunkard's Trail, Indiana Pumpkin Vine, Old Maid's Puzzle, and the Boston Trail. So another beautiful quilt there. This quilt is a summer quilt. It is very lightweight. that was used on your bed in the summertime. It is gray and white at this time, and most of the fabrics are probably quite faded from what it was originally, but they were probably more grays and whites, and the real lighter colors were probably a darker brown, or even more of the black colors that maybe had sun fading along those edges. This was probably made in the early 1900s, and they were very into dark. These were called mourning fabrics, and we're not talking early in the morning. We're talking mourning like mourning the dead. And they were very typical of the early 1900s because Queen Victoria in that time was in deep mourning for the loss of her husband, Albert, and for many years she kept the trend that it was strict adherence to the fact that if someone in your family, in your immediate family, passed away, you were to wear black for no less than a year. So you can imagine in those days with such high death rate of babies dying early, low age for dying, that women pretty much wore black all the time. So their dresses were most of the time out of black in these mourning fabrics, and so that was a very popular color. And so those were what was available for a lot of the quilts. And this, again, is a lightweight summer quilt. So the next quilt is a wool quilt, and this is a beautiful quilt. This is wool, and it's made from men's suiting material. And this was all foundation pieced onto shirting. Just show the back real quick, just a piece of the back. You can see where it was sewn onto this block of fabric, which was men's shirting material, and then the blocks were sewn together into the quilt. It's in excellent condition for wool quilts and this was probably made in the late 1800s. And for a quilt of wool to have lasted in this condition this long is almost unheard of. Bugs love wool, and even if you store it well, they have a tendency to get into them. And this has no fading, no signs of bugs, nothing. So I don't think this quilt was ever really used. It was just stored away. And Judy LaSalle added the binding around it just recently. It was never finished. So, but it really was not meant to ever be have a batting and backing put on it either. When they sewed it onto that foundation piecing, basically that's what it was meant to be. A lot of times men's pants in those days were all out of wool. Summer and winter they wore wool pants. Poor guys. But they also, a lot of women worked in the factories that made the pants, and a lot of the samples that were left over from making of the pants a lot of times were sold and given away to different stores to sell. And so this may have been just sample fabric that somebody was able to procure and make into this. So very, very nice quilt. This little quilt is a happy little quilt, and this was made probably in the 30s and 40s, judging by the fabric. A lot of 30s fabric in there, but there's a couple of 40s in there too. These were cut in the 30s and 40s by a Spokane Indian woman named Margaret Phillips Sherwood, and she was the wife of a tribal chief, Alex Sherwood. And all of the butterflies were assembled and quilted then in 1989 by Barbara Rutlinger, and she put the quilt together and then hand quilted it. And so they had been all assembled but had never been put together. So
is there embroidery around the...
Yes, yes, embroidery, little embroidery around each one of the little butterflies. So
blanket stitch?
just a darling little butterfly quilt, and a wonderful example of period fabric. It's what some of these quilts just scream. I'm from, whatever era.
Did Barbara put the
She put
sashing
the
on
sashing-
too?
Yeah.
Yes, that was just the blocks. Mhm. Okay, this is a 16 patch quilt that was made by Mrs. Thompson in the early 1890s for her expected child. This quilt is tied every 1.5 to 2.5 inches, and in place of binding, the border was brought to the back and stitched down. Ray Thomas was born in April 5th, 1894 in Iowa. He was married but had no children. In 1997, just before his death, he gave this quilt to his nurse, and I'm not going to try to say her name, unless you can tell me how to say it. Witchen? Okay, Gert Witchen, as he was afraid his treasure would be destroyed. We can tell it was treasured by the condition it is in, which is in very nice condition. There's some fading down at the very bottom, but other than that, it's in very good condition. He was living in Hamilton, Montana at the time of his death. He is buried here. Because I am a lover of old quilts, and this is Fran's quilt, and a member of the Heritage Group, Gert passed the quilt on to me for safekeeping. So it's a darling quilt. A lot of, again, those indigo blues and what have you that kind of show you that it was around that end of the 1800s quilt. Okay, so probably anybody can name this quilt. It's a grandmother's flower garden, and we have two of them here, and then just to kind of show a little bit of difference of style. The grandmother's flower garden was first published in the Gotnese magazine in 1835, but it didn't gain popularity until the 1930s. Traditionally, the centers were yellow to represent the centers of flowers, and green was used to represent the garden path. Becky Voisin acquired this quilt about 5 years ago, a gift from a friend. He had it for several years, the maker's unknown, and the fabric used in the quilt is from the 30s. It's hand quilted around all the hexagons. So, cute little quilt, definitely 30s, and in pretty decent condition. And here's another grandmother's flower garden. This one is also from the 30s and 40s. This was a very, very, very popular pattern in the 30s for sure. This is owned by Nikki Goss. Grandmother's Flower Garden was machine pieced and was hand quilted by a church ladies group who charged your grandmother, was it? Charged your grandmother a whopping $25 to hand quilt this. Unheard of, I'll tell you. This is a different arrangement than the previous garden quilt, and this came to Nikki from her mother and her grandmother. So another beautiful 30s example of a grandma's flower garden. Now this next quilt is quite amazing. This quilt is all hand-pieced and hand-quilted. The quilting pattern is a 3/4 inch grid with cable and a 1/2 inch circles with gridded centers, feathered rings, 6 stitches per inch. It's just pretty amazing. This is owned by Barbara Lazinski. It was made for Cora Sophia Rickert, who was born in 1875 in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. It is one of 3 identical quilts made for each one of her children by Cora's mother, using the children's initials in the center of the quilt. You can see this beautiful embroidered initials in the center. The date of the quilt is 1880. According to lore, someone in the neighborhood designed the embroidery patterns, and then the patterns were passed around to other quilters. This area covers only a few miles in Lancaster County. This is just an amazing quilt. It is, in my opinion, pretty close to something that should be in a museum. I mean, it is in gorgeous condition, just beautiful. Now this quilt is from the early part of the 1900s. It's all hand-pieced and hand-quilted. It is very nicely executed and would have been a quilt that the owner was very proud of. Look closely at this quilt and see that there is only one fabric that is frayed badly in this quilt. and that is that center, and then at the very points of the stars. And that fabric is pretty much gone bye-bye. And the reason that this happens is many fabrics of this time were dyed with very caustic dyes. You can see, why would one fabric do this and the rest are really fine? The reason being that many of these dyes contained iron fragments. And so that iron, microscopically, back then they didn't realize what that iron was going to do to the fabric over time in those threads. So this dye contributed to the breakdown of these certain fabrics much more quickly than the fabric that was not dyed in that manner. So this is all cotton and just a very nice quilt. And then unfortunately that one fabric is kind of gone.
Do you know what the dye?
Excuse me?
What year was that one made?
This was made in the early 1900s.
You don't know what the dye was?
It was called mordant, and it was used in a lot of red fabrics. A lot of reds. This is Judy LaSalle's quilt. It was pieced and hand quilted in 1969 by Clara Dalton Gray, the mother of Judy LaSalle. And the name of this quilt is her dad's ties. And this is a quite interesting quilt if you look at these ties, because they go back to the 40s. And, it's just interesting, some of the really wild designs that are in these ties. It's very dynamic with the ties radiating from the center, and the border gives the viewer a lot to study. She used some very interesting embroidery stitches that add detail to the quilt and enhance its vintage nature. So a very pretty tie quilt. Okay, this is called a Washington sidewalk or Washington pavement quilt. This is another quilt that's made from the early 1900s. It was made by Melissa Prophet Harshbarger, and this is a quilt that belongs to Barbara Ruttlinger also. In 1915, this lady's family left Iowa and moved and homesteaded in Fort Benton, which they finally sold in 1941. This was a very popular pattern during the Civil War, and this quilt has survived really quite well. Here's another very popular quilting pattern. This is called a Dresden plate. Dresden plate is the logo for the Bitterroot Quilters Guild. This is a very pretty executed 1930s Dresden plate. This was an unfinished quilt top. It was a gift to Barbara Ruttlinger from Kay Berg. The quilter is unknown. It was repaired, assembled, and hand quilted by Barbara in 2008. And I believe that Barbara put the border on. I don't think that was part of the whole thing. I can't remember this whole story behind it, but there was a little added to it, and she hand quilted it. And here's another variation of the Dresden plate. The border on this one, that's called an ice cream cone border. The estimated date of this quilt is the late 1930s or early 40s. It was pieced by Edith Britton from Hamilton and was hand quilted by the Corvallis Women's Church Group. It has some sun damage, and it has been restored in those blocks. It was given to Judy by Mignon, how do you say that? Mignon Conrad in May of 2001. Edith was Mignon's aunt. This little quilt is from the early 1900s. This is not pieced. This is all appliqued on there. The blue and white is appliqued onto a solid white background. This was, blue and white quilts were very popular during the early part of the 1900s. They were kind of showcased by women as their best hand-done quilts. Many owners of these blue and white quilts, they showed their best handiwork. The master bedroom in the Victorian homes was usually off of the parlor, And so when they knew they were having, they didn't use them on their beds on a daily basis, but when they knew they were having company, they would put their best quilts on the master bed so that people from the parlor could see their best work. And of course, hopefully would go, oh, can I see your best quilt? Oh, can I go see that? And so these quilts were displayed. And this poor little quilt, however, was given to me in a black garbage bag with full of mice droppings and worse. And it had been stored in a garage, and the mice had made a wonderful little home in it. So I had to cut off one whole section off the top so I could repair some of the appliques in other places, and you can, if you look closely, you can see some of the repair spots. But it was, I thought it was worth salvaging at least. But the first thing I had to do was put it in some hot water and some disinfectant and soak it a few times. So, but it did come out okay. So this is a wedding ring quilt. This is another kind of interesting icky story. This is a quilt that's owned by Sharon Renfro, and she purchased this quilt when she was at the Houston Quilt Show a few years ago, and she saw it at this booth where this guy had all these beautiful quilts, and she said, you know, I can't afford any of your quilts. And he goes, well, I have one you might be able to afford. And she goes, okay. And so he showed her this one in a sack, and it was filthy dirty, and it was covered with bug juice, and you could feel the crunchy bugs inside of it, and it stunk, and it was filthy dirty. And she goes, what do you want for it? And she didn't tell me how much she paid. But she said it was a whole lot more reasonable than the rest of them. And so he said, I don't know if any of that'll come clean or not. You know, if you buy it, you're at your own risk. He said, I'm sorry I bought it in the first place. So she bought it, and she went down to a gal who was selling quilt cleaning stuff. And she bought the quilt cleaning stuff, and she took it home, and she soaked it about 3-4 times, and it took it all out. And she said, I mean, there's hardly a stain on it. She couldn't believe it. So she's real happy with it, and she said it's all hand quilting, and it appears to be hand pieced also, obviously from the 30s. And she said the only thing is she was a little upset that it got so clean because it almost doesn't look antique or vintage anymore. But, so I thought that is along with the mice, there's bugs that get in them too, you know.
Did she
But
take a picture and send it to the guy to show him what it was?
no, I don't know. She should have.
Yeah.
Yeah, neener. And this is another quilt from Sharon Renfro. This is a summer coverlet, and this is kind of interesting. Just show them the edging. Just flip over an edge there so they can see the edging. This is not got a back or a batting in it. However, every piece in this coverlet is whip stitched. So this was never intended to have batting and a backing. Okay, this is meant to be a summer coverlet. So they just put an edging around it, and so it's very lightweight. It's from the 40s. It's definitely 40s fabric. It was found in 1998 in the basement of an old brownstone in New York City. She has no idea who made it, and it was the guy who found it was going to throw it away, and then he gave it to Sharon's mother, and then Sharon's mother sent it to Sharon and said, Sharon, get this quilted for me. And Sharon said, it's not supposed to be quilted. And she goes, well, I don't want it if it's not quilted. And she said, it's not supposed to be quilted, it's a coverlet. And she goes, well, then you keep it. And Sharon goes, okay. So she said, so now I've got this quilt, and she loves it. So that's the story of that one. But so all quilts are not meant to have, you know, batting and backing. They made a lot of coverlets this way. I bought one years ago that was rayon from the 40s, and it was painstakingly whip stitched just like this. Every piece, you know how rayon ravels, and they just whip stitched every single edge.
You can really see it on this orange one.
Yeah.
They whip stitched it in.
Yeah, so it won't, so it doesn't ravel. It would have been easier to just put some, well, serge it. They didn't have serge. Easier said than done, come on. Okay. And last but not least, is our Heritage Group put this quilt together. I can't say we because I was not here at the time. I moved to Bend for a few years, so I hate to include myself because I was not involved in this. But the group finished the piecing, they layered it with batting, and they hand quilted it. The binding was cut on the bias so that it could go around those edges. And so now everybody shares in the ownership of it and kind of passes it around and everybody gets to use it. And so that's our little quilt, and we kind of salvaged this from rack and ruin too by putting it together. So that's our little bed turning presentation. So thank you so much, and